Okay. The title of my talk is on theoretical and observational terms in Putnam's theory. A usual objection put forward against some versions of the causal theory of reference is that it can't explain the reference changes that terms may undergo. Hilary Putnam is considered as one of the main advocates of that theory. In this talk, I'll focus on the classic formulation of Putnam's theory contained in his articles of the first half of the 70s of the last century, and I'll examine the question as to whether Putnam's theory makes reference change possible. In order to elucidate this question, I'll take into consideration natural kind terms and assume their division into two groups. The first one includes those through whose usage we refer to as non-observable entities, such as the terms hydrogen or oxygen, and physical magnitude terms like electricity. The second, those that refer to observable entities, like the terms water and gold. For the sake of brevity, I'll denominate the first ones theoretical terms, and the entities belonging to their extension reference theoretical entities, while I'll allude to the second ones as observational terms, and to the entities belonging to their extension observable entities. Let's begin with the reference of theoretical terms. Oh. It is my phone. I think it is not important.
No, pero si quieres quitar el...
Let's begin with the reference of theoretical terms. Since we postulate the existence of theoretical entities to explain certain observable events, it's plausible to assume that in order to introduce theoretical terms and thus fix their reference, we need to take into consideration the observable events involved. In fact, Putnam claims that the reference of theoretical terms is fixed by means of causal descriptions, more precisely of descriptions in which the referent of a theoretical term is characterized as the entity that produces certain observable effects. This is the framework for Putnam's explanation of the reference of physical magnitude terms, concerning which he says, this account stresses causal descriptions because physical magnitudes are invariable discovered through their effects, and so the natural way to first single out a physical magnitude is as the magnitude responsible for certain effects. The form adopted by causal descriptions used to fix the reference of theoretical terms is, according to Putnam, the following. The reference of T equals the entity responsible for certain effects O in a certain way. The instances of this schema would be obtained by substituting the name of a theoretical term for T and for O some expression which describes the observable effects caused by the entity designated by the theoretical term. Concerning the form of the causal descriptions used to fix the reference of theoretical terms, it is remarkable that no explicit indication appears in them regarding the properties of the entity that causes such observable effects, although Putnam sometimes admits that in such descriptions can be resorted to certain properties of the theoretical entity. In order to prevent the content of causal descriptions from being influenced by our theories concerning the entities designated by such descriptions, Putnam makes the following assertion. In case someone resorts in the causal description of an entity, in addition to the observable effects produced by it, to certain properties the entity lacks, we could be justified in claiming that the description in question, instead of not describing anything and hence not having reference, describes, though wrongly, the entity in question. Moreover, according to Putnam, we could be justified in claiming that the reference of the theoretical term as wrongly characterized by such a description and as rarely characterized by other description, is the same. Putnam justifies such claims resorting to a methodological principle which he calls the principle of benefit of doubt, whose aim is to preserve the reference across theory change. This principle establishes that when an expert, that is par excellence a scientist, introduces a term through a description, we have to concede him the benefit of doubt, assuming that he would accept reasonable modifications of his description. One of the targets of this principle is to question the thesis of referential incommensurability, according to which theory changes involve reference changes in central terms common to successive or competing theories. This thesis, at least in some of its main versions, is based on a form of the descriptivist theory of reference, according to which the reference of the central terms of theories is determined by the principles of the theories in which they appear. As a result of this, to the extent that successive or competing theories contain different and even incompatible principles, and hence their advocates associate different descriptions or properties with such terms, the reference of the term in question will be different. In order to neutralize the thesis of referential incommensurability, it should be held that the reference of the central terms of the theories isn't determined in such a way, or even partially accepting that way of determining the reference, it should be alleged that in many cases, reasonable modifications of the descriptions associated with terms by the advocates of earlier theories make them equivalent to descriptions associated by supporters of later theories, and more specifically of present prevalent theories. However, since the modification or reformulations in question will have to be made according to the dominant theories in each historical period, it is presumable that through the application of the principle of benefit of doubt, it can sustain that the reference of terms common to former theories and to present prevailing ones is the same. In this regard, the problem is that the notion of reasonable modification or reformulation of a description isn't liable to a precise analysis, and furthermore, it is difficult to establish, perhaps with the exceptions of certain limit cases, when the reformulation of a description and hence the application itself of the principle of benefit of doubt is reasonable or unreasonable. One kind of examples in which the reformulation of a description could be reasonable is that in which the description in question, belonging to a former theory, is from the point of view of a present prevailing theory approximately correct, as it happens according to Putnam with the description of electron by Bohr. I quote Putnam's passage: "There is nothing in the world which exactly fits Bohr's description of an electron, but there are particles which approximately fit Bohr's description. They have the right charge, the right mass, and most important, they are responsible for the key effects for which Bohr thought electrons were responsible. For example, electric current is flow of these particles. The principle of benefit of doubt dictates that we treat Bohr and other experts as referring to these particles when they introduce or when they know how to use the term electron. Nevertheless, there will be cases in which the reformulation wouldn't be reasonable. Thus, for instance, in the following case, I quote, "What in the years 1880 Stoney baptized as electron was not at all an elementary particle, but the minimal quantity non-corporeal of electricity that is transported in the electrolysis, and the intersection of the extension of that concept with the extension of the present concept of electron is the empty set." In this case, the application of the principle of benefit of doubt seems to be unreasonable, and examples of this sort support the thesis that there are cases in which theory changes are accompanied by reference changes. Therefore, except in certain cases that we can consider as limit cases, exemplified by the one mentioned by Putnam concerning Bohr's conception of electron and the one pointed out by Molines, the reasonable or unreasonable character of the application of the principle of benefit of doubt is debatable. Furthermore, Putnam qualifies that when the experts who have introduced or were to introduce a term by means of a description intend this to be taken literally, it isn't possible to attribute to them a reasonable doubt. But although Putnam doesn't give any examples of it, that qualification raises an additional problem, since concerning earlier experts, we do not generally know what their intentions were. Thus we find ourselves in the situation that it will be the present experts who will have to decide on the reasonability of the application of the principle of benefit of doubt to descriptions formulated by earlier experts, in many cases without counting on evidence concerning what their intentions were. And here a debate may arise between the advocates of referential incommensurability and their opponents, and therein the principle of benefit of doubt can be of little help, since the question is precisely the reasonability of its application to particular cases. As a rule, there will be no cases where both contenders agree, except perhaps those like the two above-mentioned limit cases. According to the preceding considerations, and as far as theoretical terms are concerned, there will be theory changes regarding which Putnam could accept that they have involved or could have involved reference changes. These cases will be, on the one hand, those in which the descriptions associated with a term by experts advocating the similar theories are very different, and hence the application of the principle of benefit of doubt becomes unreasonable. On the other hand, the cases in which the descriptions associated with a term by experts who sustain the similar theories are different, and besides these experts intend, or there is a clear evidence that they intend or intended, that such a description would have to be taken literally without any modifications in that regard. At this point, it is advisable to take into account the natural kind terms I have denominated observational terms, that is, those that refer to observable entities. Thus, the question can be posed as to whether Putnam's reference theory has the resources that enable to explain the reference changes that observational terms would have been able to undergo, or at least whether it is compatible with such changes. In this respect, I'd concentrate my considerations on the natural kind term water, although not in its ordinary use, but only in its use in chemistry. On this matter, it should be pointed out that according to Putnam's theory, in his classic article, The Meaning of Meaning, the reference or extension of a natural kind term, such as water, is fixed by the relation of kind identity with paradigmatic samples of the kind. This identity relation will be constituted by underlying properties shared by such samples, in this case, by the property of being H2O. Putnam tends to assume that the delimitation of the paradigmatic samples of a natural kind, which in principle will take place through proper properties concerning their external appearance, isn't problematic. In this case, those properties are being colorless, tasteless, etc. Furthermore, he tends to suppose, at least in his articles of the 70s, that such delimitation, as well as the relation of kind identity, is independent of our theories concerning the kind, and this way neither the paradigmatic samples of a kind nor the relation of kind identity could be affected by changes in our theories about the kind. Here I'll focus on the second thesis. In this regard, it can be argued that the relation of kind identity, or in the case of the term water, the relation of substance identity, will depend partly on the metascientific conceptions of the experts regarding the notion of substance identity. This will be implicitly or explicitly contained in their theories on the substance in question, on account of which changes in those conceptions could bring about changes in the reference or extension of the corresponding substance term. In order to illustrate this assertion, it is suitable to resort to a historical example presented by Kuhn concerning the use of the term water in chemistry. According to present chemistry, water is a substance whose chemical composition is H2O and can be in solid, liquid, or gaseous state. Therefore, the extension of the term water consists of samples whose chemical composition is H2O, independently of their being in solid, liquid, or gaseous state. However, Kuhn points out that this was not so according to the chemical theory prevailing around 1750. Kuhn asserts that at that time, that is before the chemical revolution, which took place in the 80s of the 18th century, different chemical substances corresponded to different states of aggregation, that is, to the solid, liquid, and gaseous state, since it was held that the chemical substance could only be in one of those states, and in the way water was conceived in 1750, an essential property of water consisted, according to Kuhn, in being a liquid. Therefore, the reference of the term water, as this term was used in the chemistry of 1750, wouldn't be determined in the language of present science simply by H2O, but by H2O in liquid state. From here, Kuhn concludes, and I'd conclude with him, that the extension of the term water, as it was used in the chemistry of 1750, and as it is used at present, is different. According to the metascientific conception of the notion of substance identity prevailing in the chemistry of 1750, a piece of ice and a sample of water in liquid state would be instances of different substances, and hence they couldn't be in the relation of substance identity, although they are in such a relation according to the conception of substance identity in present-day chemistry. Nevertheless, I don't intend to make use here of Kuhn's authority as a historian of science. If someone were to question the historical veracity of Kuhn's example, I'd ask him to carry out a thought experiment in which he imagined that in about 1750, a scientific community had proposed such a theory of water, of course, not as a mere stipulation. In that case, it seems reasonable to assert that in their use of the term water, the extension of this term would be partially different from that corresponding to the use in present-day chemistry. We can summarize a part of our preceding considerations concerning observational terms as follows. According to Putnam's reference theory, the reference of an observational natural kind term is fixed by the relation of kind identity with paradigmatic objects of the kind. But in the use of such terms in science, the relation of kind identity will depend partly on the metascientific conception of experts about the notion of kind identity, which will be implicitly contained in such theories if they aren't explicitly incorporated into them. Therefore, change in our theories can bring about reference changes. And a pluralist Putnam, like the one after the writings of the 70s, would possibly assent to the following considerations. In his own words, different descriptions of the nature of a natural kind should lead to not quite coextensive criteria for membership in the kind. The conclusion to be drawn is that the reference of natural kind terms, or the list of observational terms, is determined by the relation of kind identity with paradigmatic members of the kind, and hence by the properties constituting that relation, and at the linguistic level by the corresponding description, as well by the theories in which they appear. Therefore, change in those theories can bring about changes in the reference of natural kind terms. And here the references. Thanks.
I'm not very familiar with this, and I should read also with more detail. So, I'm going to ask a question from some work I'm doing on philosophy of biology, and maybe I don't know if it makes sense because maybe it is not really related. So there are some. I'm thinking about the term gene in genetics. So gene was first a theoretical term because Mendel postulated the existence of an entity to account for phenotypic traits, but actually was not an observable term, right? But later on, it became an observable one when Watson actually discovered the DNA. So what about these kind of changes? I mean, changes where we kind of have terms that, and I wouldn't say that. I mean, there are problems now with post-genomics, but if we focus only on Mendelian and molecular genetics, those two, they are not about what is going on today, that is more complex. I don't say that there is a change of reference, even if, we have even two, an theoretical and an observational one. So,
of course, first I would say that the distinction between observational entities and theoretical entities is historic relative. I mean, entities that once were considered as theoretical have come to be now observational terms. But in any of these cases, I would apply these considerations. I mean, if they are theoretical terms, one had to take into account how these terms were introduced in the theory. And it would apply my arguments possibly. And in case they are observational terms, of course, I couldn't apply the same consideration as concerning water, but I would claim that if there are metascientific changes on the notions of substance concerning those entities, then would apply also my considerations. I mean, Putnam has not, besides the term water, he has taken into consideration terms of biology, like the term tiger.
yeah.
And as we know, there are very different theories about the identity of species.
Sure.
And Putnam makes the same reasoning that there is, depending on the notion of substance identity corresponding to those theories, the reference of a tiger would be partially different.
I see.
And it is the same consideration but applied to terms of biology.
One question. I have one question, but the question is not even clear for me, so I'm trying to make it clear. There is this discussion about the reference of general terms, for example, natural kind terms or kind terms in general. There's this discussion first whether even the notion of reference applies to such terms or not. And second, there is this discussion about what would be the reference of a general term or a kind term, whether it be extension, maybe, or something different. Many people argue that we should understand the extension of a general term as its reference, that it may be that two different kind terms that refer to different things actually have the same extension, and such people typically or sometimes at least argue that a general term would maybe, if we want to apply the notion of reference to general terms or kind terms, maybe we should understand that such terms refer to properties, or maybe if we are essentialist, like Ferna was in those papers, to essences or essential properties or something like that. But maybe, if I go right your paper and the talk, you took it that the reference of a natural kind term is its extension. So my question, if I may, how would more, I mean, I know that you didn't talk about this, but how would this story go if we understood that the reference of a natural kind term like water is some sort of essential property? Could there be, in the Putnamian theory, a change of reference if we understood that the reference of a natural kind term is, for example, in the case of water is being H2O?
First, there are different views about the reference of a natural kind term. According to some authors like Putnam, the reference is its extension, as is the set of the entities to which the term applies. According to other authors, the reference of a natural kind term is not its extension, a set, the set of the entities to which it applies, but each and every of the entities belonging to their extension. There are other views according to which the reference of a natural kind term is an universal considered as an abstract entity. So there are different views on the reference of natural kind terms. Now, according to you say that Putnam speaks of essence, but many times in quotes. He is not committed to the view, and it is the usual interpretation, but according to Putnam it is not so. It is not committed to the view that it is an essence of the members of a natural kind term. Thus, let us suppose, of course, if you suppose that the members of a natural kind have an essence, and it is discovered that the essence was incorrect, we could to apply the term to different entities as the ones before considered as members of the kind. And that in this case, we could sustain that there has been a change of reference. But in Putnam's view, he says, he doesn't believe very strongly in the essence of the members of a natural kind. This is the usual interpretation, but when one takes into consideration more or less carefully the passages by Putnam, he wrote the word essence and similar ones in quotes, so as he is not being completely committed to the view that the members of a natural kind have an essence in common. Besides, there are other assertions by Putnam in this sense. He says usually the properties that determine the reference of natural kind terms are the most interesting properties. But the notion of interest is relative to the speakers. So, the thesis that according to Putnam, the members of a natural kind term have an essence that univocally determines the reference of natural kind terms can be attacked from different points of view.
Following up, and I think I'm going to make a question that is actually just asking you to maybe to repeat what you say, so sorry about this. So I agree with you that the essentialist reading of Putnam, I don't think it is, there are all the possible readings, I don't think he was actually defending the kind of essentialism that is usually attributed to him, because he usually uses essences. So I was wondering, taking this into consideration, whether one could kind of stretch the principle of the benefit of the doubt to accommodate the commensability and the central relativity and all of these things, and to accommodate cases like the one Kuhn presented, where you have a kind that was before the chemistry or whatever. Couldn't he just say, well, that's precisely what I mean, because the substance kind identity depends on the user, but still, couldn't he just accommodate that? Or?
Well, you could say that in this case, applying the principle of benefit of doubt, perhaps you could say you can make similar course view to the one maintained before Dan Kuhn, for the following reason, because although according to Kuhn and other philosophers of chemistry before, let us say the year 1750, an essential property of water was being a liquid, so that a piece of ice wouldn't be the same substance. Also, if ice is heaten, then it becomes water. So you can say, well, there are not the same substance, but they are so similar that one of them you can be transformed in the other, and so apply the principle of benefit of doubt. Perhaps.
Just follow up for ignorant. There's this strong intuition that water cannot be in the solid state is a false utterance that the old chemists uttered and were justified to believe, maybe, but that was false, and that's precisely why we substitute the views in the theory for that in which, for that to be false, water, the term water, has to refer to water, and not to water in liquid state. I mean, like, obviously, I'm not sympathetic with Kuhn's views on truth and all the right, but what would be the argument for denying that? For saying that it's a case of change, reference change, so that utterance by them was true, and now after that as is false.
So my argument for the view that there was a change of reference is, of course, to take into account that according to the notion of substance identity before the chemical revolution, then a substance could only be in one of these states, and according to this, to the interpretation of Kuhn, an essential property of water was to be a liquid, so that even if you apply the term water to an entity that is not liquid, it wouldn't be the same substance that the water liquid, that the liquid water.
But it's sort of circularity there, right? So you have to assume that the conception and beliefs that the beliefs people held, even experts had about some systems, each will determine its reference. If you are direct referential, as you say, no, this is they were pointing to some substance, and they held wrong beliefs about them, thinking that a certain property was essential when it was not. So how would you, let's break
comment within that, how they people use the term water. They use it to refer to an entity which is in liquid state, not to refer to a substance that is in another state. So the extension of the term water, as was used by those authors, is different. That is what I would say.
Well, maybe you can at some point, it's been suggested that for Putnam, some natural time truth, they have some uneven indexing. Water, it's short for that water, and so this is what brings us back. In particular, it's useful to deal with two cases. You see, so water and clean water. So, and wouldn't this someone that water is short for that water or this water, wouldn't someone this kind of both in the Middle Age and nowadays, speaking of water, we are speaking about the same thing, which brings back to H2O, and we can assume what the reference of a natural current must be is the extension But from a metaphysical viewpoint, the extension is determined by the essence. So everything which is as an essence H2O is water, like on in Earth, the essence will be X, Y, Z, so it's a different extension.
What do you understand under the essence of a substance kind term?
Here we have to go with Greek.
Greek is essentially in difference to Putnam, and natural science term can be introduced in two different ways. They can be introduced by ostension or by description, and Greek says considers the possibility that the introduction by ostension can be subsumed under the introduction by ostension. Also, even if your argument about the introduction by ostension would apply, it wouldn't apply to introduction by description. And in the introduction by description, you usually mention the properties, the so-called superficial properties that the speakers associate with the term.
Yeah, but the description in such a case can be understood on one hand as a referential use of the description. So whatever the proper case or whatever can be a misguided description, but still so much sensitive because the object you intend to talk about. So water, if it's short for that substance, liquid, and so on, etc., etc. Well, that, what I got there, it can be expressed like a cat and that, and the description may be misleading, misguided. So it's a description, and when you introduce it by description a substance, if we understand the description as used in a referential way, so we probably, I don't know,
First, the introduction by ostension is not pure ostension, because there is an ambiguity in the case of ostension. Also, you have to complement the ostension with a general term, for instance, and in the case of water would be that liquid, not only that liquid. And in the case of description, as I have said, these authors consider that this description contains the superficial properties of water, of the liquid water, in our well, and that makes that these terms can be rigid designators because of the use of our well. I don't know if I have answered your question.
yeah, you answered, but it seems to me, once again, if you introduce by ostension a substance, you use roughly a complex demonstrative, and a complex demonstrative works more or less like a referential use of a definite description to some extent. And so there is not such a big, there wouldn't be such a big difference between introduced by ostension as a complex demonstrative or by description as a description understood in the referential way.
And with this both Putnam and Kripke makes that difference between introduction by ostension or introduction by description. But of course, both have to determine the same substance. Otherwise, it doesn't work. And I don't know if I have understood it rightly. You speak about the referential use of descriptions. Yeah. Yes, but these authors, or at least Putnam, would say that these descriptions are used in an attributive way, not in a referential way.
I have sort of disconnecting. Another question. Is there anything like any analysis like that, instead of taking chemistry or something like that type, takes semantics. For instance, the notion, the word, the term possible word, you know, it seems like an interesting case. Say, well, how was it used by Leibniz, and then by Pinky, and then by Lewis, and then by, and I don't know if you thought about it, but other using, of course, they have different views on whether there is a reference for the term, for instance. For Lewis, they will have a, you know, an extension. Kirke will say there's no way, I mean, they'll be crazy, there are no things, universes, or anything like that. I mean, of course, they have different theories. On the other hand, many philosophers of language would say nowadays, well, I'm going to use Lewis's concept of possible word without his metaphysical commitments. So they say, can it be possible from a point of, from a point of view that take the reference of the term to be dependent of the theoretical particular theory used, or on the other hand, I don't know if they are natural kind terms or theoretical terms, but then I don't know would it count as the effects that are supposed to be explained by the theoretical term, like possible word. I don't know if that framework, I mean, the question briefly put is, can this framework be used to something like possible word?
Now, in the case of a possible world, I would say there are different conceptions about possible world, and of course, according to different conceptions, there would be the extension of possible world would be different. But I mean, this doesn't has no effect about the problem that I have dealt here, because here I suppose I have not entered into the notion of possible world, because I have not entered, for instance, in the claim if they are rigid designators or not. If you deal with the subject, if they are rigid designator or not, you have to take into account the notion of possible world. But here this notion is not, it doesn't appear. But I would say, of course, there are different conceptions of possible worlds, and according to them, the notion of possible world would have a different extension, probably.
So you have to have some view on the extension of the term possible word before using it in your theory.
Yes, of course. Of course.
So I'm saying about that makes sense to say, no, I'm using the term without saying anything about whether I'm Lewisian or I'm Christian or I'm Spanakarian about possible.
Yeah, and that have influence on the notion on the problem of the rigidity of natural kind terms. If you accept the view of Lewis about possible worlds, natural kind terms are not rigid. Are not rigid. Proper names are not rigid either. That it depends on the notion of possible world. You assume you can claim or you can argue if a term is rigid or not. And I think that this has the influence of the notion of possible world for these considerations about if natural kind terms are rigid designators or proper names are rigid designators and so on.
Way, and it's like it's just my interest to see how you would apply your theory that you presented here to a problem that I am working on in biology. So I am going to, if it is a way, if there is a way, I'm going to put this. If there is no way to, to apply your theory to this problem, then don't worry. I mean, that's I'm trying to. So there is this distinction in evolutionary biology and in philosophy of evolutionary biology between synchronic species and diachronic species, right? So that in a way it's also like different theories to determine what a species is, but they just have to do with time, right? So evolutionary biology that accounts for the way in which the mechanisms of evolution take place refer usually, when they use species, refer usually to synchronic species, that is, organisms that coexist in time, right? They coexist and they are alive, because they must contribute something to the gene flow. So they are alive, they are living together, and they coexist. They can reproduce, and then they are short periods of time, where reproduce, competence, cooperation can take place. And then the diachronic species is the one to which systematic biology refers to. Because it's the one, the whole segment of the tree of life of particular species includes also dead organisms and living organisms, and from the origination, the origin of a species up to its extinction. But I have this intuition that it is that they refer to this, they must refer to the same thing. They must be equivalent, because otherwise, it's like nonsense to think that what causes evolution and the result of evolution is a different species. So one thing is that dynamic species that is operating, and then the resulting one in the whole tree of life. For me, it's very counterintuitive to think of that like of two different entities. That is what they defend, because there are some organisms that belong to one that don't belong to the other one, because the dead organisms, for instance, belong to the diachronic species, but not to the station of the synchronic species. This is more or less my problem, right? So that I have the intuition that they must be in order to make sense of evolution. The evolved entity must be the same one as the evolving entity, otherwise, what are you explaining? But they consider them two different entities, these diachronic approaches or synchronic approaches. Could your theory help me out with this, to say, applying something to say that we are talking about the same reference, or I don't know. I know it's a very weird question.
Also, the extension of the notion of species is different in both ways, or you would claim that that the extension is the same.
Well, I'm talking about the species in general, but here I would say a particular Homo sapiens, right? So we are talking about particular species, not about the term species, but about particular species. So the term would be Homo sapiens. It would be different according to them, because the extension includes dead and living organisms in diachronic, but only living organisms in synchronic entities, because only those can contribute to the gene flow. But for me, it doesn't make sense. So if the extension is different, then the reference must be different, and the entity must be different. This is what you...
If you consider the extension of a natural kind term like the reference, of course, if the extension is different, the reference is different. But what these authors sometimes say, and it appears here also in the passage by Putnam, look at this. Different descriptions of the nature of a natural kind should lead to not quite coextensive criteria for membership in the kind. Also, they are not telling that a change of view bring with it that you are speaking about quite different things. Only that the extension, when you use a term according to a theory and the same term according to another theory, the extension are not the same, but there is some difference between the extension of one term according to one theory and another. But of course, if you claim that they are the same, I could ask you what arguments you have to claim that they are the same.
Well, this one that I don't think that it makes sense to think of the evolving entity as different from the evolved one. So it's like saying, well, this has a lot of different type, but it's like saying, you look at me right now, you know, and you think of me at this time synchronic with yourself, you know, and we are thinking about this entity, this is going to be different from the Maria extended in time from her birth to her death, no? Like, that we have this other extended entity in time. But of course I have, you know, cells now that I didn't have in the past, and I will have cells.
But Mariana is not a natural kind.
No, yeah, no, I'm trying to make an analogy about my intuition about the species. Well, so I'm trying to make an analogy. I know what that is not a kind, right? So I have like some parts that are my cells that have changed, and then the organisms that constitute the extension of the class, Homo sapiens, have also changed. So, that's the thing, right? But I want it to be the same one, because otherwise I cannot make sense of evolution, like saying it has an origin, but the parts, the organs that constitute the extension have changed in time. So I'm trying to relate that, this consideration that you are making to the fact that extensions change in time. Because of, for instance, in the case of evolution, because of birth and death, right, of organisms. But I mean, I know it's kind of relate to figure out if how would Putnam deal with this problem I have. So,
for me, the problem is if, of course, our theories do not determine completely what there is, but if they have some influence or not. And I would claim that there is some influence, not completely, but some influence. For instance, here, the difference or the extension of a natural kind term is not completely different, but the terms are not coextensive, but they are quite coextensive, because then otherwise we will be talking about different things, and it doesn't seem to be plausible as you claim.
Just a clarificatory question concerning the question that Maria did, and I don't know if it has something to do with what you said. When you said that there are kind of like two diachronic or
asynchronic.
asynchronic, and you said one includes the dead organisms. And you are assuming that includes, so I am taking that includes all known dead organisms. That there might be not known dead organisms that might influence those branches. You know?
Yeah.
So maybe this is why they distinguish, because they don't know which dead organisms that were there that contributed
To the gene flow.
because they don't know them. So
Yeah.
maybe they leave it open that this is according to what we know.
Yeah.
But maybe other dead organisms define the natural kind, define it, but we cannot know that they collaborate. So in those terms, they might not match the current ones with the past ones.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah, I understand that. I understand you, but that's so interesting.
Sorry.
But no, that. I mean, when they divide synchronic and diachronic species, they are thinking of synchronic ones are the ones that evolutionary biology refers to, and then you are having those considerations in mind all the time. Evolutionary biology is worried, concerned about how organisms contribute to the gene flow, and then in the past there might have been things that we don't know, some organisms that we don't know that might have contributed. But the diachronic entity that I was talking about is the one by systematics biology. The systematics biology only wants to classify. It's not explaining evolution. It's to having the classification
Mhm.
of the whole tree of life. So they have, this is interesting because sometimes there are different purposes in the research that is being done, two different purposes. And then the purpose is not explaining how the contribution of but only being able to say, this was an Homo sapiens, yes, this was not, yes, and then to cut, as it were, to cut the tree of life. This is the only concern. So, I don't know if different research proposals, as it were, or research intentions, research purposes, can influence also the way in which we determine reference.
I am not a specialist in philosophy of biology. My only consideration is the following also. Given the numerous views on the notion of species, some authors would claim, like Putnam does, that the criteria to include an entity in one of these species is not completely the same as in the other, as according to other view. I mean, I have dealt especially with natural kind terms that are substance terms, water, gold, and so on, not so much concerning names, species names. But the situation is much more complicated given the multitude of views concerning the notion of species and henceforth, according to criteria of the identity of species, when a thing belongs to an species or to another, and being the criteria so diverse, it could be argued that the extension of the term species is not the same concerning all views on species. And Putnam makes the argument concerning the time. I do not remember, concerning a name for a sort of animal, and his claim is just that. Also, does the extension of that term depends on the notion of species you assume, and hence of the theory about the species you assume.
On that I agree completely. So you can have different concepts of species, and then that might determine the phenotypic or the genetic or the ecological can give rise to different entities. But my problem is that it's not about conceptual changes. It's about the change in the reality, the change of the organisms that belong to the species.
Putnam, in the last part of his life, was very, very pluralist. And concerning dogs, he says, we should not take into consideration only the biological theories about dogs, but also the interest of those who have a dog. They should also be, they also have to be into consideration to decide if one entity is a dog or not. But this notion is so broad that everything goes.
So we're going to leave it here. Thank you very much.